So starting with the hazards. The hazards that are profiled in this plan include severe weather, hurricanes and tropical storms, flooding and dam failure, wildfire and conflagration, drought, geological hazards such as earthquakes, hazardous materials, terrorist events, and climate change. And when I say profiled, I mean that each hazard has a more detailed description, including location, timing, and duration of impact, severity of the impact, frequency of occurrences, and history of occurrences, and probability of future events. And these are all specific to the town. So it's looking back at the history of what has happened for each hazard in town. So in short, each hazard profile explains what will be affected, who will be impacted, and it also provides an estimate of losses and impacted critical facilities. After the hazard profiles, this next section of the plan looks at vulnerable areas. To look at vulnerable areas, the committee needed to evaluate the vulnerability, to assess the vulnerability. So the stage 2 in the middle here comes after identifying the hazards and before choosing mitigation actions. So when assessing vulnerability, the questions asked are, what is likely to be damaged and how severe will the damage be? Vulnerability in this case was assessed on an evaluation scale, looking at the hazard frequency and the vulnerability scope. Within the hazard frequency, it was broken up into 4 categories, from unlikely to ever occur to may occur every 10 to 15 years, may occur between 2 and 10 years, or will occur with some regularity. And then the scope was divided into 4 categories of the scope, how many individuals or areas would be impacted, including population system not affected at all, to some mild disturbance, to all or severe disturbance, to the entire town significantly affected. This is a map from the report, from the report in front of you, and it provides examples of vulnerable areas. I've just pointed out a few here. For example, group homes, propane facilities are vulnerable areas, and wildfire and flooding might be hazards that could impact those vulnerable areas. Copies of this map were available when you walked in case you wanted to take a closer look. The vulnerable areas were ranked in priority order from the local hazard mitigation committee, starting with number 1 being the highest priority, being vulnerable populations such as low income, disabled, elderly, and children, followed by vulnerable business districts, in this case the Atlantic Beach District, followed by critical roads, Berkeley Ave, Birchwood, Champlain, Forest Ave, Green End, Oliphant, Third Beach, Wave, Wood, East Main, Statuesque Point, and Wave Avenue Bridge. Then hazardous material evacuation zones around St. George's Ice Rink, BJ's, Newport Propane, and Taylor Rentals, followed by the Wave Ave Sewage Pump Station, Paradise Ave Sewage Pump Station, and then evacuation route intersections at East Main Road at Forest Valley, West Main Road at Forest Valley, Admiral Calpus, Coddington, East Main, and Green End at Valley and Aquidneck. Finally, 8 is essential services such as utility lines and communication avenues, followed by the Maidford River and Bailey Brook, dams and reservoirs, campgrounds and trailer parks. Recent development projects, including stormwater VMPs, those are located at Island Drive, Overlea Farm, Valley View, Windover Farm, Wave Ave, Aquidneck, Highlands, which is Julia Court, Saltwood Farm, and Bay Ridge. Number 14, shoreline property, and finally the lowest priority being vegetated wildlife areas, Satchwest Point, Norman Bird Sanctuary, and Albro Woods. The next section is the mitigation actions. The mitigation actions are identified to help mitigate the hazard's impact. When choosing mitigation actions, the committee used a metric using social, technical, administrative, political, legal, economic, and environmental factors. So, does the measure treat people fairly? And that answers the question of how it functions socially. Will it work? Is it feasible? Is it technically feasible? Administratively, is there capacity to implement and manage the project? Politically, is there public support? Legally, do we have the authority to implement such a practice? Economically, is it cost beneficial? Is there funding? And environmentally, will there be any adverse impacts?
Can we go back to that? Are they organized in terms of what's the most important one there? Or are they just listed?
It's just a listing.
Okay.
Yes, not priority.
Would it make any difference if they were? I would think number 2 might be the most important one, and then you can sort of, if it's not going to work or feasible, everybody's in trouble, and the rest of the stuff falls out.
Sure.
So, just a thought.
Generally, the mitigation actions can be grouped into these 5 bullet points. Generally, all of the mitigation actions are trying to improve infrastructure to reduce hazards, incorporate hazard mitigation into town regulations, increase public education and outreach, management of natural features to reduce hazards, and provide support to vulnerable populations before hazard events occur. There are a few specific examples of hazard mitigation actions that I called out here, and then there is a full listing of all the hazard mitigation actions that I'll put up towards the end. You also have a copy of that on your bench as you came in. So a few examples of mitigation actions. One is to offer technical assistance on business continuity plans, specifically coordinate with REMA and provide workshops for businesses. Another example is to study offering buses from low-income neighborhoods to evacuation shelters. The actions that the town would need to take to do this is to determine need and discuss options. Some more examples of action items that were in the 2014 update that have been completed. Reduce inflow and infiltration at the Wave-Ave pump station. This slip line project is underway to prevent seepage. And also extension of Buck Road to serve as an evacuation route. And the town acquired an easement and completed the road. I have a full listing of all of the mitigation actions here, and if the board would like, I can read through these. They're also available as you walked in.
I'm thinking unless the board really wishes to, there's probably not a need to ask Rita to read through
Agreed.
the full table. I think you can do that on your own.
I've already read through it in the report, so I'm okay.
All
I'm
right.
good as well. Thank you, Ryan.
There are the 15 listed here with their corresponding mitigation action items in the right-hand column. Like I said, there are sheets in the foyer when you walked in. And that concludes the presentation.
Okay, before we receive comments from the public, I'd like to open it up to members of the planning board. Does anyone have any comments? DJ?
Yes, I do, and naturally, of course, it has to do with trees and the tree commission. If you look on page 97, it's Article 7.A2. There is something that could be added to that. The Arbor Day group has awarded the Tree Commission a very special plaque, and they have sent 3 or 4 plaques which designate Middletown as a special tree city, and that is one of the things that I think that is extremely important for Middletown, considering the valley, the park there, everything that has been done, and over 1,000 trees have been planted throughout the town by the Tree Commission. And this is a special award that is only given to, I would say, special groups. You have to apply for it, you have to fill out a form for it, and it has to be okayed by your town council. So, that's it. I think that could be added in.
Well, I think what would be helpful is to have the tree commission provide what information they have on the trees that have been planted, because this action item talks about creating a database, an inventory of the town trees.
But they have that.
So whatever information they have towards helping us produce that, creating a GIS layer of all the town trees, that would be helpful.
They have already done this, as a matter of fact, and it's amazing. Newport has its trees listed in this informative place, and also the secretary of the Tree Commission has been putting trees on this dedicated place, and he has it all recorded, so he could give that to you. It's already been done.
Great, thank you.
Michael?
One of the major hazards, from a storm is the loss of power, especially during the winter times. I've noticed lately there seems to be an upgrade to the grid, the electrical grid on the island. I was just wondering how that impacts our mitigation plans, and how it might take care of some of the problems we've run into in the past, because it's hopefully it's a more hardened grid and it's probably less vulnerable to loss of power.
All right.
Is there any way of assessing that and figuring how that can be evaluated, in this overall?
Well, maybe we could add some information about what National Grid has done in the process of doing. It's not something that the town is responsible for, aside from, I guess, the related work of making sure trees don't fall on power lines to the extent that we can. But the town's not responsible for maintaining the electrical grid. So I think maybe just a reference to the work that National Grid has been doing would...
But yeah, it talks to our vulnerabilities though, right?
Yeah.
And, maybe we're less vulnerable now after what they did.
Right.
So.
Yep.
Art?
Is there any provision, or do we need a provision to actually test some of the ramifications of worst-case planning to stand up our resources to see about the logistics of it in terms of communications, supplies, those kind of things? I don't know.
I hate to put Peter on the spot, but as the EMA director, perhaps he's better able to answer that question. If you don't mind, Pete. If you could just maybe restate the question.
Yeah, it seems every time we really have a challenge, we come together and get it done. I'm just asking, is there any utility to having some kind of a non-real situation exercise just to test the system to see?
There definitely is. There's some merits to having that. We do test redundant communications. We do have different levels of that. Both, we have a VHF radio system, we have an 800 radio system, and then we have a backup which we use to communicate through REMA as well. So the communication aspect is kind of tested kind of on multiple layers, even on a monthly basis. One of the things that Newport's just doing now is actually kind of using a family radio service as another backup to the backup. But there definitely is the ability to test test those before we really need them.
Okay, and so the state probably has a test to make sure everybody's tied in from time to time?
Yes,
Yeah.
the M-STARS radio is something that is we're able to communicate with all the EOCs in the state and back to Cranston, which is its own radio system outside of our 800 megahertz radio system and our VHF as well.
Okay, thanks.
Other comments? Well, I have some comments. I did safety and risk management for 10 years of my career and included quantitative risk assessments, so I'm somewhat familiar with this. And the first thing I want to say is this is quite an impressive effort. I mean, I've seen hazard mitigation plans that were done by many large corporations, and this is better than a lot of the ones that I saw. So I want to start with that. Then I have some comments. When you're talking about evacuation, do you mean evacuation from the island or from shoreline areas, or exactly what do you mean?
I think it depends on the hazard. It's probably not evacuation from the island. It would be more localized evacuation from flood-prone areas.
Yeah, to high areas.
Right.
Yeah.
Or if there was a power outage affecting, for example, a senior citizen area like Bay Ridge, for example, where folks might need power, they might have to be evacuated, or certainly nursing homes and that sort of thing.
Well, you might want to add a few words to just mention.
Clarify.
mention that.
Yeah.
When we were doing quantitative risk assessments and we looked at an array of possible events that could happen, and of course you associate a frequency of occurrence with each one. When you're doing a thorough quantitative risk assessment, you look at the probabilities of occurrence with great, well, I was going to say with great accuracy, but none of them are really accurate. But if you're doing a risk matrix, as is done here, and you're looking at broad categories, usually the divisions in the frequency are orders of magnitude. I say that because when you put it up on the screen, you had 4 categories. The first one was not likely to occur. The second one was every 10 to 15 years. The third was every 1 to 10 years. And the fourth was with great regularity. In quantitative risk, the difference between 1 and 10 years and 10 and 15 years is not very much. And I would suggest that you look at that second category, instead of being 10 to 15 years, make it 10 to 100 years to give you that order of magnitude difference. And I think that would help in classifying these different vulnerabilities and be more effective in the end.
So if I might just, on that point, one thing to understand too is that the format of the plan, including I think some of what you're talking about, is dictated by FEMA. We have to go by the format that they that they require. I don't know if that's, I'm thinking that might be one of the things that they have determined this is what you are addressing. We can look into it.
Yeah, all of my comments, I'm just suggesting that you do
Sure.
look into it. If FEMA dictates it, then obviously you have to follow what FEMA is telling you. I'm just giving you the benefit of my experience for what it's worth. I also found it a little confusing in reading this because when you look at the title, it says reducing risk from natural hazards. And even in the presentation, the emphasis was on natural hazards. But as you read through it, you talk about including hazardous materials and terrorist attacks. And they are included.
Right.
So I think you have to clean that up somewhat, to either include them or don't include them or whatever.
We have to include them. Again, that was from on high. These are things that we're supposed to include in the plan, whether perhaps the title of the document is what we could change.
Well, you read the title and that orients the reader,
Right.
So that's the way you're thinking when you dive into it, and then suddenly you see these other hazards that are presented. Okay, give me a minute to go through my markers. Not all of them are questions. showed you that. Just as a point to note, you have a table in here that talks about the major Rhode Island hurricanes, and then you follow that with other significant storms, and for some reason, the storm of 1944 never gets captured. You know, the hurricane of 38 flooded Providence. The storm of 44 also flooded Providence. If you go down to Providence and look at the high water marks, they're right beside each other. And it was the storm of 44 that actually convinced Providence to put the hurricane gates in, not the storm of 38. Actually, it might have even been Carol in 54. But there was a serious storm in 44. Check it out. Google it. You'll
We'll
find
look
it.
for it.
But it always amazes me because it flooded Providence. Okay, on page 79, there's a chart. And I looked at that chart and it bothered me because, first of all, there's also a chart on page 81 too, and the same comments apply. First of all, there are no units on the ordinate axis. From reading the text and reading the chart, you can look at the title, it says observed number of hot days. So you assume the ordinate is number of days, and yet when you look at the graphs, you see fractions of a day, and I don't know what that means. You know, I would expect that to be all whole numbers.
Right.
So check that out.
Yep.
Same thing applies to the chart on page 81.
Maybe it was only hot for half a day.
I was waiting for that comment. I'm glad you said it.
So there was, you know, when I got to the action plan, you know, one of the questions that occurred to me was who's doing the monitoring? And as I kept reading, that question is answered very nicely. The Hazard Mitigation Committee does monitoring. What was lacking was how often the committee meets to monitor. So my question is, what is the frequency that the Mitigation Committee meets for monitoring the action plan items and the progress on those action plan items? Again, you
We'll
don't
get
have to
that.
answer it here,
Yep.
but I think something should be said about the frequency of meeting.
Yep.
And my last comment, in these graphs at the end, there's a typo. You saw the typo. Instead of, it should be parcels and the title. That's it. Those are my comments. Again, I want to reiterate, I think this is a pretty impressive effort. It's nice work.
It is.
I'll have to give Kevin credit for doing a lot of the grunt work. He worked with the committee, he corralled the committee on several occasions for the meetings, and he did a good job of getting this draft started.
Who was the consultant also?
There was no consultant this
Wasn't
time. We had a
McGuire?
consultant
Wasn't
for the
McGuire?
last, what's that?
Wasn't McGuire part of
That
it?
was for the last go-round in 2014.
Oh.
We decided in working with the committee that there probably wasn't the need for a consultant with the level of update that was going to be needed.
Anyway, it's a good job. Maybe I'll send an email to Kevin. And
Please do.
is his email still the same?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so at this point, are there any members of the public who would like to speak, comment on the hazard mitigation plan? Please, come on up.
Hello, how are you? Carrie Lewis. So two major things is walking through, say, traffic flow. So say it's a hurricane, it's September, still pretty busy tourist season. I know, and here it mentioned some sort of system. I believe it's a traffic flow system that we're looking at. Any comment? Is there a certain traffic flow regulations if there's some major hurricane in the middle of a tourist season?
Are you referencing something in the?
Yes,
Or
there's
can you give us
also a part
page?
in here, I'm trying to find it, one second. There's a Opticom sensors on traffic signals. Is this like a, what is, I don't know what
That's for
Opticom
emergency
is.
vehicles, so that they can get control over the signals as they're going through.
All right, and then we have an evacuation route, which will be, I assume,
Right.
monitored, and traffic flow. Second concern, too, is did anyone do a study as to how much shelter space we're going to need? So again, if it's middle of tourist season, we have tons more people that are staying with us. We need a place to put everyone. Or we just pick and choose people, I guess, I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know if, Peter, you have any
is there any
comments on
increase in
how
shelter?
the
I mean, we're talking
shelter-
about, nursing homes, group homes, what about
Right.
residents? And, one of the major concerns where I live is Lower Quinnic Avenue.
Yes.
Yeah, we-
Actually, that second point is a good point, because even in here, it's
yeah,
pointed out
it's
that
talked about.
the
So,
town is already lacking in,
and we work very
shelter
closely with the
space.
Red Cross on shelters, which maybe, Peter, you can just quickly talk about.
Yes, we do work with the Red Cross as far as the shelters go, and we are, they're in the process of reevaluating all the shelters right now. They typically do say when we have an evacuation, and again, it's all dependent on whether it's a flooding situation or the reason for the evacuation. The studies say that 10% of the population is going to utilize the shelter, and that's the number that we're looking to get to. We have the Gaudet, which is the regional shelter, and then we have Middletown High School, which is our backup shelter. So we're still shy on those numbers, and that is one thing that we're kind of looking at. And there's some criteria in order to meet the Red Cross shelter standards that we'd have to do with the other schools or other possibilities.
so
for
what are you
shelter.
doing to try to meet that?
We're working with the Red Cross right now to evaluate all of our shelters, and once we get those numbers together, to try to come up with a plan of how we can expand that if need be.
Do you have other shelters besides the middle school and the high school?
As of right now, just the high school and the middle school are official shelters that meet the Red Cross standard. And a lot of it's due to
So
even,
you
like,
say you're
window
working with
walls.
the Red Cross. Do you have other planned shelters or shelters that you're looking to bring online as official shelters?
At this time, we would look at the other schools to see if they'd be eligible to become shelters. They're very specific criteria as far as having the backup generators, even everything down to the number of bathrooms for how many people that they can accommodate.
Do you look at any private sector facilities?
We could. It'd kind of be another level of planning, but usually just as far as the availability goes, we've kind of limited right now to the town buildings.
So, with all the school talk more recently, there was discussion that there's going to be some need to do some work on the schools. So any potential improvements that might happen there that would help the schools become compliant, I'm sure will be taken into consideration.
Yes.
And, thank you. Thanks, Peter. And another question, the 10% is, I think really more your question is 10%, you said 10% of the population typically gets sheltered in an event. That's pretty typical, standard?
That's not my numbers. That's going by I believe it's the Army Corps of Engineers,
Okay.
in conjunction with the
So
Red
that-
Cross the Army Corps of Engineers does the evacuation studies and
Yeah.
has done them basically for all the coastal
That's
communities.
interesting, thanks. I guess 10% of the population in the summertime is a lot higher than 10% in the wintertime. So obviously, I'm assuming that's all taken into consideration in all the formulas that
It
and
is.
put out there.
There's there's a big number that they take into all the
Right.
different factors that they take into account for that. It's typically for a tourist that's visiting here. If there's a hurricane, usually they're not going to shelter here. They're probably going to go home. There is some
Right,
of that
right.
factored into it.
That's kind of what I think you were asking. Something
Yeah,
along those
And
lines. Interesting, thank you.
Difference between,
Mhm.
10% of population versus 10% of everyone's going to be
Yeah.
here. during
Exactly.
school summer.
It's a tough formula, but it's reality potentially,
Mhm.
hopefully never, but it is, could be.
I think since and actually Rita just mentioned this, since it's not an action item in the mitigation plan to do the work that you're already doing and planning to do, I think we should probably put that in the plan as something that the town is undertaking to evaluate the shelter space that we need.
I think that's a very important one, because the numbers right now are pretty lacking. By the way, you have a good data point from last winter when, the gas we
Yes.
lost gas heat and you sheltered a lot of
Right.
people. So
Well,
you
that-
got a data point there for at least winter.
And that was kind of a different situation, since there was a responsible party that was involved there, National Grid. We really only ended up sheltering a few people for most of that, and most of it was
Because
put
they
into.
they put people up in the hotel.
Exactly, and luckily that was during the wintertime when there's plenty of availability,
Yeah.
and there was a responsible party to actually pay for that sheltering.
But at least you have some numbers, right? I mean, you can
Yes.
get numbers,
Mhm.
even if you didn't shelter them.
Yes.
So if it's going to be an action item, Ron, I think that's a good suggestion. I'd like to maybe at least some component of considering the schools, any potential work to the schools, that at least there's an awareness of it, that I'm assuming there is, but if we make it an action item, where if and when schools are,
Well, I don't know that I want to specify. I would leave it to the EMA director with the Red Cross to do the evaluation, not
Yeah.
specify which buildings they should be looking at.
I'm not looking for any particular schools, I'm just saying keep it out there so that it's,
You can,
yeah, exactly. I'm not looking to pick and choose properties. I'm saying at least make it an action item that it's considered. The work that's going to be done on any of the schools, take into account that some upgrades can be made to any school, any property, town property, if it's going to be considered for a shelter and meet the criteria for a shelter.
Well, I think the other point that's been raised too is you need to have a delta on, is it the tourist season or not? Obviously, the tourist season is going to impact the number of beds and everything. If you had a hurricane in August, that's much different than maybe losing the power in December.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's true, too.
Do you have anything further?
Yeah, it's just some odds and ends. I don't know if it's even part of anything you can answer. So yeah, bringing back what you were saying about tying in. So don't forget National Grid, they housed them at hotels. These hotels are going to be underwater. I mean, we're in the flood level. So either way, I don't know if it's any part of what we're discussing today. Is there any thoughts on increasing like the wall at Easton's Beach for, say storm surges or anything like that? Or that's totally up to town?
It hasn't been talked about.
All right, how about like any increase to sewage or like any increase, if there's a flood area, is there any increase for water runoff?
There's discussion of upgrades at the Wave Avenue pump station,
Okay,
upgrades that have already been done as
Mhm.
well. So that's, given its location, it's certainly vulnerable. And there is talk in the plan about the need to reduce infiltration into the system. So when water does rise, it flows, it's not necessarily stormwater, it's groundwater getting into the sewer lines,
Mhm.
overtaxing the system. So that is discussed in the plan as well.
all right, and Green End Pond, is that a dammed pond, is that?
There's a whole section in here on the
Yeah.
dam issue. There's 3 ponds identified
Mhm.
as being potential hazards. All of them are, the ones that are discussed as being problematic are owned by the City of Newport Water Department. So it's all discussed in the
Okay,
plan.
so
yeah.
we tying into account like Newport, like with Middletown in this flood action plan, is that, we're
They-
kind of commingling right now?
Well, coincidentally, they're working on their own hazard mitigation plan as
Mm-hmm.
well, and I communicated with the planner in Newport, so they're going to coordinate
Okay.
their effort.
Just looking through, some of the things, one of the highlights in here as well. So when you mentioned the highest flood land or flood area, I believe the top was the lower Quinnick Avenue, Wave Avenue.
Right.
We go further into bullet points. One is limiting development around Bailey's Brook. I don't see any major restrictions or anything down by Quinnick Wave Avenue that's, putting in a preventive tie for, floods or water runoff or.
So there's no so-called mitigation measure to reduce development. That's sort of a general planning concern. This plan is trying to identify specific measures that the town can take to reduce the impacts. So I guess what I'm saying is that particular concern is a broader town land use planning issue that isn't going to get addressed in this sort of a plan.
So the part of Bailey's Brook, where does some of these bullet points come from as far as as far as the bullet points, as far as, you know, Bailey's Brook and what they want to do around that area? Like, I don't see a
Well, it's
huge-
recognized, so the plan recognizes the potential hazards in the vulnerable areas, so identifies Bailey Brook as being a vulnerable area
Mhm.
and also a hazard in terms of flooding.
Mhm.
And there are some mitigation measures in here, for example, where roads might be inundated by the overflowing brooks, there's mitigation measures to raise the roads and that sort of thing. But it's not, if I'm understanding where you're going, it's not necessarily going to get to the level of talking about restricting development in the watershed of Bailey Brook or something like that.
Mhm. And then I think just add, I think using a number one point of where the highest flooding area is, maybe even discussing, like I said, something about like even the walls, you know, maybe
Yeah.
increase walls at least, I know it's money, but,
Right.
or increase sewage runoff. I mean, there's a big area of flood already on Wave Avenue area with just a minor rainfall right now.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what a hurricane would look like at this point.
Right. And
Um,
also, when development does happen, making sure it happens in accordance with flood
Mhm.
protection requirements, and even for existing development, encouraging property owners of existing buildings to take some proactive measures to help protect their buildings from future floods.
Yeah, because it said in here, develop incentives for property owners. I mean, what is?
Yeah, I mean, there's
And
nothing.
flood insurance alone, I don't think anyone can afford that, so.
There's nothing specified in terms of what the incentives might be, but
Mhm.
the town can certainly consider creating some kind of an incentive to have folks flood-proof their properties.
Mhm. All right. I think that's it. Buses, so the public transportation, I think we mentioned buses for low income. Like, is there like a transportation system? We're talking about pre-game and pre-planning. Is there going to be like an automatic, like, we'll have a
So the action
transportation?
item is to evaluate that, look at what the options are.
Mhm.
During the discussion with the committee, the concern was, you know, if there was something happening, again, for an example, in a low-income neighborhood that's subject to flood potential, and we had to get a bunch of people out of there that maybe didn't have the ability to get out quickly, how can we get those people out quickly? The town officials partnering with a transportation company, whether it's a school bus company or RIPTA or whoever it might be, to get some buses quickly and get people out of harm's way. Nothing's been decided. We don't know yet how that would work, but that's something that the action item would address.
I think just that might be a good suggestion too, when we're talking about an increase, if it's the middle of summer or something, get a, you know, maybe as well, get a sort of a system for
Right.
transportation for quick and easy, not just for low income, but maybe people
For
in
anybody,
those
sure.
high areas too,
Yep.
to kind of manage, you know, to make it safer and more manageable, to get out quickly might be a good idea as well. I think that's it. All right, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Well,
guys.
thank you for your comments. I really appreciate your
problem,
comments.
thanks.
Thank you. Any other members of the public who would like to speak? Hello, Terry. You don't want to, no comments? Okay. May I have a motion to close the public hearing?
Motion
So-
made.
Second.
Motion's made and seconded to close the public hearing. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Public hearing is closed. Ron, what action do you need us to take on this?
That's really it for tonight. So we'll take the comments that we received. We've got a couple of items that we need to address in the plan. One or two new action items will be inserted into the plan. We'll produce a revised draft. There's really no, in my mind, need for an additional meeting of the planning board on this, but we can certainly get you that revised draft, give you an opportunity to look at it. We do need to get this out to REMA and then to FEMA as quickly as possible to make sure that we keep on that time frame of having it approved by them and then brought back for adoption by the town, hopefully by the end of the year. So we'll keep it moving.
So you don't need any action
No
from us?
action necessary.
Hey, Ron, question, what kind of, I haven't seen the website in a bit, is there, that might point to something like this, where somebody was asking about our hazard mitigation plan. On the planning page, I would imagine, there's something that indicates what the activity of the committee is.
She's pulling it up for you.
No big deal, I'm just curious, if I were a resident and had a question, obviously I'm gonna Google it, obviously, that's what we all do, right?
Yeah.
But I'm just curious if what they do, they go and they find hazard mit and there somewhere, and whatever's happening, it's out there.
So information about tonight's meeting was underneath the public notice.
Yeah,
And there's the hazard mitigation plan, the current plan, and then today's presented 2019 draft.
so will that go away though, and if the left-hand side of,
We can create a separate page just for
Yeah.
the hazard mitigation plan and keep it up there indefinitely.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's,
I think that would be good, too.
to keep
Yeah.
people informed, yeah,
Yeah.
and me particularly, if I want to get it
Yeah.
electronically, you know, I can get to it quickly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Do any other business of the board? I have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion is made and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.